Nebraska Territory. Late October, 1867. Nobody noticed what was happening in that shelter. From the outside, it looked like a hillside with a wooden door. Maybe a root cellar. Maybe storage. Most folks riding past Mariah Coldwell's claim didn't give a second thought. But inside that mound of prairie earth, something remarkable was unfolding. A reality that would challenge everything the settlement understood about surviving winter on the Great Plains. By mid-December, when temperatures plunged to -18 Fahrenheit and firewood became more valuable than gold, Mariah's children played in shirt sleeves while her neighbors burned through cords of cottonwood just to keep frost off their walls. What did this widow understand about the earth itself that experienced builders had missed? Today, you're going to see how a structure dismissed as primitive outperformed every timber cabin within 50 miles, and the numbers that finally made the doubters go silent. If you want to discover one proven frontier technique every week that actually worked when lives depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Let's go back to that October day when Mariah Coldwell made a decision that seemed like madness. Mariah Coldwell wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was trying to survive. Her husband had died that spring, thrown from a wagon crossing Shell Creek during the runoff. Left her with 3 children under 10, a quarter-section claim she couldn't abandon, and a half-finished dugout that leaked mud every time it rained. The timber cabin they planned would have taken 2 men a full season to build. She didn't have 2 men. She didn't have a full season. What she had was November coming fast. Her nearest neighbors, the Pritchards, lived 4 miles east in a proper sod house. Thick walls, wood frame, shingled roof. They'd offered to take the children for the winter. No shame in it, Mariah, Eli Pritchard had said, not unkindly. Woman alone out here, it ain't meant to be. She'd thanked him, declined, because Mariah had noticed something the previous winter, back when her husband was alive and they'd sheltered in that leaking dugout. On the coldest nights when the wind screamed across the prairie and their breath froze on the blankets, the back wall of the dugout, the wall that pressed into the hillside, stayed strangely warm to the touch. Not hot, just constant. While the exposed walls turned to ice, that earth-backed wall felt almost alive. Her husband had chalked it up to their body heat pooling. Mariah wasn't so sure. She'd grown up in Kentucky, in hill country where families kept root cellars that stayed 50 degrees year-round without fire or ice. Potatoes didn't freeze in January. Milk didn't spoil in July. The earth, she knew, had its own memory of temperature, its own rhythm. What if she didn't fight the prairie? What if she worked with it? The idea came to her in pieces. Extend the dugout deeper into the hillside. Not just a room against the earth, a room inside the earth. Lower the floor. Thicken the roof. Create a tunnel entrance that would trap cold air before it reached the living space. Use the thermal mass of the soil itself as a blanket that never wore thin. It sounded insane even in her own head. But the children were coughing at night. The cottonwood scraps she could gather alone wouldn't heat a timber cabin through December, let alone February. And Eli Pritchard's offer, kind as it was, meant giving up the claim, meant starting over somewhere else with nothing. So on a cool morning in late October, with frost silvering the buffalo grass, Mariah Coldwell picked up a spade and started digging. Her daughter, Ruth, 8 years old and serious beyond her years, watched from the doorway. "Mama, what are you doing?" "Making us a home, baby. It looks like a hole." Mariah leaned on the spade, wiping her forehead. "For now," she said. "But you wait. Come January, this hole's going to be the warmest place in Nebraska." Ruth didn't look convinced. Neither did the prairie wind, which picked up that afternoon and blew cold enough to ache. What Mariah built over the next 6 weeks didn't look like any dwelling her neighbors had seen. She excavated 12 feet into the south-facing slope of a low hill near the creek. Not a shallow scrape. A proper excavation, cutting down 4 feet below grade and back into the hillside until she had a chamber roughly 14 feet wide and 16 feet deep. The work was brutal. Every shovelful of clay-heavy soil had to be carried out, sorted, and set aside. Her hands blistered, then calloused. The children helped when they could, hauling buckets of earth. But Mariah had a plan, and she followed it with the precision of a woman who couldn't afford mistakes. First, she dug the floor below frost line, 4 feet down, where winter's fingers couldn't reach. At that depth, even in the cruelest January, the earth holds steady near 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the same principle that keeps wells from freezing and root vegetables alive through spring. Second, she angled the back wall into the hill, creating a contact surface with undisturbed soil. Not a veneer, a full thermal connection. That wall would pull heat from the Earth's natural geothermal gradient, where every 100 feet of depth adds roughly 3 degrees of warmth. At her depth, she was tapping into a reservoir of stable temperature that didn't care about blizzards. Third, she built a roof thick. Not the typical sod house style of thin earth over wood beams, but a layered system. Cottonwood logs for structure, then willow brush, then 2 feet of compacted clay mixed with prairie grass, then another foot of loose soil for insulation. Total thickness, nearly 3 feet of earth. That mass wouldn't just block wind. It would absorb heat during the day and radiate it back at night, smoothing out temperature swings. Fourth, and this is where neighbors really started whispering, she built an entrance tunnel, instead of a door that opened directly into the living space. Letting every gust of wind pour inside, she dug a sloped corridor 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, dropping another 2 feet below the main floor. Cold air, being denser than warm air, would pool in that tunnel like water in a bucket. It became an airlock, a thermal buffer. You descend into cold, then step up into warmth. She lined the tunnel walls with stones hauled from the creek, sandstone and limestone she'd selected for their density. By day, those stones would warm slightly from body heat and ambient temperature. By night, they'd release that warmth slowly, keeping the tunnel from turning into an ice chute. Finally, she installed a small ventilation shaft near the roof peak, a vertical chimney lined with clay, angled to catch prevailing winds and create a gentle draw. Fresh air could enter through the tunnel, circulate through the chamber, and exit through the shaft without creating drafts. It was passive ventilation, no dampers or mechanisms, just geometry and pressure. When Eli Pritchard rode by in mid-November and saw the mound of earth with a timber-framed doorway sunk into the hillside, he pulled his horse up short. "Mariah," he called, that's a root cellar." She straightened from tamping the roof soil, face streaked with dirt. "It's a house, Eli." He dismounted, walked closer, peered into the dark entrance tunnel. "You're putting the children in there?" "I'm putting all of us in there." He shook his head slowly. "Mariah, that's a hole in the ground. Come spring, that'll cave in or flood, or, hell, you'll suffocate. There's no windows. There's no hearth. How are you going to heat it?" "I'm not," she said simply. Pritchard stared at her. "You're not. The earth's going to do it." He looked at the mound, then back at her, and she saw it in his eyes. The same look the preacher's wife had given her at Sunday meeting, the same look the trader at Lone Tree Station had given her when she'd asked for spades instead of lumber. Pity mixed with certainty that she'd lost her way. "Mariah," he said quietly, "winter's coming. You got options. Don't do this out of pride." She didn't argue. She just nodded, thanked him for checking on her, and went back to work, because she'd already done the math in her head. The Pritchard sod house, with its exposed walls and wood-heated interior, would burn a quarter cord of firewood every week just to keep the temperature above freezing. Mariah had maybe 2 cords total, scraps, deadfall, and cottonwood she'd gathered herself. 2 cords wouldn't get a traditional dwelling past Christmas. But 2 cords, used sparingly for cooking and emergency warmth in a structure insulated by 12 tons of earth, that might last all winter. It wasn't pride. It was arithmetic. By late November, the shelter was finished. Mariah moved the children inside. Ruth carried the blankets. The boys, 6-year-old Samuel and 4-year-old William, carried the tin dishes and the family Bible. Mariah carried the lantern and a small iron stove she'd used for cooking, not heating. The door closed behind them with a heavy sound, like sealing a tomb. Outside, the first snow began to fall. Nobody said much to Mariah's face. Frontier courtesy still held. even when folks thought you'd gone strange. But the talk circulated, quiet, persistent, almost sympathetic. At the Lone Tree Station, where settlers gathered to collect mail and trade goods, the conversation turned to the Coldwell widow and her cave. "Heard she's living underground now," said Howard Macklin, a carpenter who'd built half the claimed shanties in the territory. He leaned against the counter, shaking his head. "Dug herself a hole and put the kids in it like prairie dogs." The station keeper, a German immigrant named Otto Schreiber, frowned. "She asked you for help building proper shelter?" "Didn't ask nobody. Just started digging." A trapper named Silas Venn, waiting for flour, snorted. "Living in dirt. That's what happens when a woman tries to hold a claim alone. Ain't natural." "It's sad is what it is," added Macklin. "Those kids deserve better. Come February, she'll either freeze or smother. Maybe both." They didn't hate Mariah. They genuinely believed she'd made a tragic mistake. The kind of mistake that ended with children's graves on the prairie and a claim returned to open land. Even the women, gathering at the church for a quilting circle, spoke in hushed tones. "I tried to talk sense into her," said Elizabeth Pritchard, Eli's wife. "Told her she could stay with us through winter, then make proper plans come spring. But she's got that stubborn Coldwell pride." "It's not a home," said another woman, stitching carefully. "It's a burrow. My husband says there's no chimney, no hearth. How's she keeping warm?" "She's not," Elizabeth said quietly. "That's the problem. She thinks the dirt will do it." One of the younger women, newly married, looked up. "Can it keep you warm, I mean?" The older women exchanged glances. "Honey," Elizabeth said, "dirt is dirt. It ain't a stove." The younger woman went back to her stitching, cheeks flushed, and said nothing more. But the doubt wasn't confined to station talk and quilting circles. It lived in the glances Mariah got when she rode into town for supplies, in the way conversation stopped when she approached, in the careful politeness that felt worse than open criticism. Once, passing the Hutchinson claim, she'd seen their children playing outside, bundled in coats, breath steaming. They'd stopped and stared as she rode by. One boy, maybe 10, had called out, "You really live in a hole?" Mariah had kept writing. The silence from her own children was harder. Ruth, especially, had gone quiet those first weeks underground. She'd help with chores, read to her brothers by lantern light, never complained. But sometimes Mariah would catch her daughter staring at the earthen walls, at the low ceiling of logs and soil, and the question was clear, even unspoken. Is this really home? One evening in early December, after the boys were asleep, Ruth finally asked it aloud. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" They were sitting near the small iron stove, which Mariah kept burning low for cooking, not heating. The temperature in the shelter hovered around 68 degrees, comfortable enough for wool dresses and a shawl. Outside, according to the Pritchard's thermometer she'd glimpsed last visit, it was 29. Mariah pulled Ruth close. "We're going to be better than okay, baby. It doesn't feel like a house." "I know. The Pritchard kids have real beds. And windows." "They do." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Billy Hutchinson said we live like animals." Mariah felt the anger rise, hot and quick, but she kept her voice steady. "Billy Hutchinson lives in a sod house that leaks rain and burns firewood like a hungry beast. We live in a shelter that stays warm without burning anything at all. You tell me who's smarter." Ruth looked up at her. "But how? How does it stay warm?" And for the first time, Mariah explained it, not as a desperate gamble, but as a system. She told Ruth about thermal mass, about how the earth below frost line stays near 50 degrees all winter, about how their body heat and the small stove gently warmed the soil around them, and that soil held the warmth like a battery made of clay, about how the thick roof stopped heat from escaping upward, and the tunnel entrance stopped cold air from pouring in. "The earth remembers warmth," Mariah said. "It doesn't let go easy. That's why root cellars work. That's why this works." Ruth listened, her serious young face lit by the stove's glow. "So we're inside a battery?" Mariah smiled. "Something like that. But outside the shelter, in cabins and sod houses across the territory, the consensus remained. Mariah Coldwell had made a terrible, stubborn mistake. And when winter truly arrived, the kind of winter that killed cattle and froze wells solid, the truth would come out. It didn't have to wait long. The blizzard struck on December 18th, 1867, and it came with a fury that old-timers would reference for decades. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours. By evening, it was -12 Fahrenheit and falling. By midnight, -18. The wind hit 40 miles per hour, driving snow so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. It lasted 3 days without pause. In the Pritchard house, Eli and Elizabeth burned through half a cord of firewood in the first 48 hours, feeding their stove every 2 hours around the clock. The temperature inside their sod house hovered between 38 and 45 degrees. Ice formed on the inside of their door. The children slept in coats, huddled under every blanket they owned. At the Hutchinson claim, the situation was worse. Their shanty, built fast and cheap from cottonwood, had gaps in the walls where the chinking had failed. The wind screamed through. They burned furniture, chairs, a table, part of a bed frame, just to keep the stove alive. By the third day, they were down to kindling and prayers. Howard Macklin, the carpenter who'd called Mariah's shelter a hole, ran out of firewood on day 2. He broke apart an old wagon bed and burned it. His wife developed frostbite on 3 fingers from trying to cook in the unheated half of their cabin. At the Lone Tree Station, Otto Schreiber kept the stove roaring for travelers who staggered and half-frozen. He went through 2 cords in 72 hours. The station held heat better than most. Thick sod walls, central location. But even he admitted later that he'd never been so cold indoors in his life. And 4 miles from the Pritchard place, down a slope near Shell Creek, Mariah Coldwell's mound of earth sat silent under 3 feet of snow. No smoke rose from it. No light showed through cracks. Passing riders, what few were brave or desperate enough to travel, assumed it was abandoned. Assumed, perhaps, that Mariah had finally given up and taken the children somewhere safer. Inside, Ruth was teaching her brothers to play checkers on a board scratched into a flat stone. The temperature in the shelter had dropped slightly since the storm began, down from its usual 70 degrees to about 66, but it was holding. The thick earthen walls absorbed the cold slowly, like a massive sponge that refused to saturate. The tunnel entrance trapped the frigid air in its lower section, creating a pool of cold that never reached the living chamber. The ventilation shaft, partially blocked by snow, reduced fresh air exchange, but prevented dangerous buildup of moisture or stale air. Mariah had lit the small stove twice, once to cook cornmeal mush, once to heat water for washing. Otherwise, it sat cold. They didn't need it. "Mama," William asked on the second night, "why is it loud outside?" "That's the wind, baby." "Is it trying to get in?" Ruth, who'd grown protective of her brothers, answered before Mariah could. "It can't get in. The earth won't let it." And she was right. The storm raged. The temperature outside plunged to -22 on the third night, cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. But 12 feet into that hillside, surrounded by tons of soil that held summer's memory in its molecular bonds, the Coldwell family stayed warm enough to sleep without shivering. On the 4th morning, the wind died. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp it hurt to look at. The prairie was a white desert, drifted and alien. Mariah opened the door to her tunnel entrance, clearing the snow, and stepped outside. The air bit her lungs. The sun was brilliant, but gave no warmth. Smoke rose from the Pritchard place, thin and desperate. She didn't know it yet, but at that moment, Eli Pritchard was harnessing his horse, preparing to ride out and check on her. Preparing, really, for a recovery mission. Because no one could have survived 3 days in a hole in the ground without fire during a storm like that. He was wrong, and the numbers that would come out in the days after would make him, and everyone else, go very, very quiet. Stay with me, because what happened next changed how people thought about shelter on the Great Plains forever. If this story is proving something you've wondered about, hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you faced was. The truth was about to surface, measured, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Eli Pritchard reached Mariah's claim on the afternoon of December 22nd, for days after the blizzard hit. He'd ridden slow, breaking trail through drifts that came up to his horse's chest. The landscape was unrecognizable, every familiar landmark buried or reshaped by wind. He carried rope and a shovel, supplies for digging out a collapsed structure. He'd seen what prairie storms could do to sod houses. A dugout? He expected to find a cave-in, maybe worse. What he found was Mariah hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between two cottonwood poles. He pulled up short, staring. She wore a wool dress and shawl, no coat. Her cheeks were pink from cold, but she moved easily, methodically, pinning wet clothes to the line like it was a spring morning. Mariah? His voice came out hoarse. She turned, shading her eyes against the sun. Eli, didn't expect company. Are you? He dismounted, boots crunching through the snow crust. Are the children? They're fine. Inside playing. You want to come in? I've got coffee on. He followed her to the mound, still half convinced he was seeing things. The entrance tunnel was clear, snow piled neatly to either side. He had a duck to enter, descending the sloped corridor. Cold air pooled around his legs. He could feel it, denser and heavier than the air above. Then he stepped up into the main chamber and stopped. It was warm. Not fireplace warm, not stove blast warm, but genuinely, comfortably warm. Like stepping into a house where the hearth had been burning all day, even though there was no hearth. Ruth and the boys looked up from their game, startled by the visitor. They wore simple dresses and shirts, no coats, no blankets wrapped around them. William, the youngest, was barefoot. Eli pulled off his hat slowly, looking around. The earthen walls were smooth, almost polished, supported by timber framing at intervals. The ceiling was low but solid. A small iron stove sat in one corner, cold to the touch. Shelves held their supplies. A lantern hung from a beam, unlit because daylight came through the entrance tunnel. And the temperature, he could feel it on his skin, in his lungs, had to be at least 65, maybe 70 degrees. Ow, he said finally. Mariah poured coffee from a pot that had been resting on the cold stove. Told you, the earth does it, but there's no fire. Don't need one. Haven't lit the stove except for cooking since the storm started. Eli took the cup, wrapping his hands around it more out of habit than need. His mind was working, trying to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he knew about winter survival. Our place got down to 38 inside. We burned through. He shook his head. Mariah, what's the temperature in here? Right now? She shrugged. Don't have a thermometer. But it's warm enough we don't need coats. He'd brought a thermometer. Part of his recovery kit, though he'd expected to be measuring cold, not warmth. He pulled it from his coat pocket, held it up away from his body heat, and waited. The mercury climbed, settled, 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Eli stared at the glass tube like it had betrayed him. That's impossible. Is it? Mariah sat down on a bench built into the wall. I'm sitting here, Eli. My children are sitting here. We're warm. We've been warm since November. Used maybe 1/10 of a cord for cooking. Didn't burn a single stick for heat. He sat down too, heavily, because his legs had gone uncertain. How long can it hold like this? Don't know yet, but it's been steady. Dropped a few degrees during the storm, maybe down to 66 or so, but it came back up after. I think as long as we're living in here, breathing, moving around, our heat feeds into the soil, and it just holds it. Thermal mass, Eli said quietly. He'd heard the term once from a railroad engineer talking about masonry stoves. You're living inside a thermal battery. That's what Ruth called it. Ruth looked up proud. Eli stood, walked to the back wall, pressed his palm against the earth. It was cool, but not cold, and solid as stone. How deep does this go into the hill? 12 feet. Down 4 feet below grade. And the roof. 3 feet of earth. Layered, logs, brush, clay soil. He did the math in his head. Rough, but close enough. The chamber was about 14 by 16 feet, with walls and roof averaging 2 feet of soil contact. That meant, conservatively, at least 12 tons of earth in direct thermal contact with the living space. Soil has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. 12 tons is 24,000 pounds. which meant that soil could store and release nearly 5,000 BTUs per degree of temperature change. A human body produces about 330 BTUs per hour. 3 humans, Mariah and the children, produced roughly 1,000 BTUs per hour, maybe 8,000 over an 8-hour night. That heat, instead of escaping through thin walls and a leaky roof, was being absorbed by the surrounding soil, held in that thermal mass, and radiated back slowly. It was brilliantly, devastatingly simple. Eli? Mariah's voice pulled him back. He turned to face her. You've built something? Mariah, this is better than what I have. Better than what anyone I know has. She smiled just a little. Told you the earth would do it. Words spread slowly at first, the way truth spreads when it contradicts belief. Eli told his wife that night. Elizabeth didn't believe him until she visited herself 3 days later and felt the warmth, saw the children playing comfortably, touched the cold stove with her own hand. Howard Macklin, the carpenter, heard the story at Lone Tree Station and rode out to see for himself. He brought his thermometer, measured 71 degrees inside, while his own cabin, 4 miles away, was struggling to maintain 45 with a roaring fire. He stood in that earthen chamber for 20 minutes, silent, recalculating everything he thought he knew about frontier construction. No fire at all? He asked finally. Just for cooking, Mariah confirmed. And during the blizzard? Dropped to about 66. Came back up after. Macklin looked at the tunnel entrance, the thick roof, the walls pressing into undisturbed hillside. How much did this cost you? In materials? The timbers I already had. The labor was free, just me and the children. Maybe $10 in tools and nails. He did his own math. His cabin had cost $80 in lumber, $20 in labor, and burned $15 to $20 in firewood every winter. Mariah's shelter had cost 1/10 of that and used virtually no fuel. Jesus Christ, he said quietly. The comparison data came together over the next few weeks as neighbors compared notes. Pritchard's sod house averaged 42 degrees Fahrenheit inside during the coldest week. Burned 1.5 cords of firewood in 3 weeks. Families slept in coats. Hutchinson's shanty averaged 38 degrees Fahrenheit inside during the coldest week. Burned 2 cords plus furniture. Developed ice on interior walls. Macklin cabin averaged 45 degrees Fahrenheit inside during the coldest week. Burned 1.8 cords. Required constant fire tending every 2 to 3 hours. Coldwell Earth Shelter averaged 71 degrees Fahrenheit inside during the coldest week. Burned 0.1 cord, cooking only. No fire tending needed for heat. Temperature stable within 5-degree range regardless of outside conditions. The most striking number came from a week in late January when the temperature outside dropped to -15 overnight and stayed below 0 for 6 consecutive days. Mariah's shelter maintained 70 degrees. The Pritchard house, with Eli burning wood desperately around the clock, managed 39. That 31-degree difference, achieved with 0 fuel for heating, made believers out of skeptics. But the real proof came in spring, when supplies could be tallied and costs calculated. Mariah had entered winter with 2 cords of firewood. She emerged in March with over 1.5 cords remaining. She'd burned less than 1/4 cord total, all for cooking, none for heating. At prevailing prices, that represented about $12 in fuel savings. Her neighbors, collectively, had burned through 30 to 40 cords. At $8 per cord, that was $240 to $320 in fuel costs for the settlement. Mariah Coldwell had spent 0, and her children, when the doctor visited in April for routine checks, showed no signs of respiratory illness, frostbite, or the chronic cough that plagued kids who'd spent winter in cold, smoky cabins. The numbers didn't lie. The earth had kept them warmer, healthier, and safer than timber and fire ever could. By the winter of 1868 to 69, for more earth shelters had been built within 20 miles of Mariah's claim. Nobody called them Coldwell shelters or gave Mariah formal credit. Frontier knowledge didn't work that way. But if you talk to the families who built them, the Hendersons, the Yates, the McAllisters, the German family whose name nobody spelled the same way twice, they'd all say the same thing, saw what Mariah Coldwell did. Figure it made sense. The designs varied. Some folks dug into hillsides like Mariah had. Others, on flat land, built up earthen berms around timber frames, creating semi-subterranean structures. The Yates family incorporated a root cellar design with a living chamber above it, using the cold storage below as an airlock. The McAllisters built theirs with a southern exposure and a bank of windows that caught winter sun, warming the interior mass even further. But the core principle remained: let the earth do the work. Howard Macklin, who'd once called Mariah's shelter a hole, built one for his own family in 1870. His version was more elaborate: timber framing, proper door, plastered interior walls. But the concept was identical. Earth roof, earth walls, entrance tunnel, deep foundation. He measured temperatures meticulously that first winter. Average interior of 74 degrees, fuel consumption down 83% compared to his old cabin. He didn't apologize to Mariah directly. But one spring day, delivering a repaired wagon wheel to her claim, he'd lingered at the entrance to her shelter and said, "I was wrong about this." She looked up from planting. "About what?" "Called it a hole. Called it foolish. People say all kinds of things." "Yeah, but I built houses for 15 years, and I didn't understand what you understood in one season." He'd shifted his weight, uncomfortable with admitting it. "You were right. The earth's warmer than fire ever was." Mariah had smiled, small, private. Earth doesn't run out, either. The shift wasn't dramatic. There was no newspaper article, no official recognition. The territorial government didn't issue grants or building codes. But quietly, practically, the knowledge spread. Travelers passing through the region started noticing the earthen mounds, the entrances cut into hillsides. Some thought they were storage. Others, more observant, realized they were homes. By 1872, an Army Corps surveyor mapping the Platte River Valley noted in his journal, encountered numerous dugout-style dwellings, more sophisticated than typical frontier construction. Inhabitants report superior thermal performance and reduced fuel needs. He didn't know who'd started it. But Mariah Coldwell, by then remarried to a stonemason named Benjamin Rourke, was living in a larger version of her original shelter. This one with 2 chambers, a proper cooking hearth, and enough space for the 6 children they'd eventually raise together. That shelter, expanded and improved over decades, would remain occupied until 1923. 56 years of continuous use. When it was finally abandoned, not because it failed, but because the family moved to town, the interior walls were still solid, the roof still intact, the temperature still steady. The lesson took longer to spread beyond Nebraska territory, but it did spread. Earth shelter construction appeared in Kansas, the Dakotas, parts of Montana. Not everywhere. Flat, sandy soil didn't work as well as clay-heavy prairie earth. But where conditions allowed, the principle proved itself. Modern engineers, studying vernacular architecture of the Great Plains, would eventually recognize what Mariah had understood intuitively. The earth below frost line maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on latitude. Any structure that integrates with that thermal mass, rather than fighting it with thin walls and forced heating, can achieve remarkable efficiency. They'd calculate the numbers with precision. 12 tons of soil at 0.2 BTU/LB/degree F provides a thermal battery of 4,800 BTU/degree F. Human occupation and minimal cooking can add 8,000 to 12,000 BTU over 8 hours. With proper insulation above, preventing heat escape, and thermal coupling below and behind, pulling stable earth temperature, interior temperatures stabilize naturally in the mid-60s to low 70s Fahrenheit. No fuel, no fire, just physics. Mariah Coldwell didn't have the terminology, but she had the understanding. And more importantly, she had the courage to build it when everyone told her it wouldn't work. On a winter morning in 1899, 32 years after that first blizzard, a young homesteader named Catherine Boone visited the Rourke household to ask Mariah about building an earth shelter. They sat in the main chamber, drinking coffee, while snow fell outside. The temperature inside was 72 degrees. The stove in the corner was cold. "How did you know it would work?" Catherine asked. Mariah, now in her 50s, gray-haired and steady-eyed, considered the question. I didn't know, not for certain, but I knew the earth stayed warm in the root cellar. Knew it stayed cool in summer, warm in winter. Figured if I could live inside that stability instead of fighting it with fire and timber, I'd be better off. But people thought you were crazy. People think all kinds of things. Mariah smiled. The earth doesn't care what people think. It just does what it does. You work with it, it works with you. Catherine looked around the chamber. The smooth walls, the comfortable warmth, the shelves lined with preserved goods. It's still here. After all these years. Built right, earth lasts longer than wood. And it's always warm. The younger woman nodded slowly. I want to build one. On my claim, out past Willow Creek. Then build it. Dig deep, roof thick, tunnel entrance. Let the earth do the work. Will you help me? Mariah had smiled. Don't need my help. You got the idea. That's all it takes. The wisdom Mariah Coldwell proved that winter wasn't ancient. It was older than ancient. It was fundamental. The earth holds temperature. Mass stores heat. Insulation prevents loss. Simple principles available to anyone willing to dig. She didn't invent earth shelter construction. Humans have been building into hillsides and under berms since the Neolithic. But she proved with numbers, with survival, with 3 decades of continuous occupation, that frontier settlers didn't need to burn forests to stay warm. They just needed to remember what the earth had always offered: stability, storage, and silence. No firewood, no smoke, no frozen children, just 73 degrees of warmth, held in 12 tons of prairie soil through the coldest winter Nebraska territory had ever seen. That's not primitive. That's engineering. And it worked. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you've ever faced was. Have you ever thought about earth shelter building? Would you try something like Mariah's design today? Let me know below. And if this story showed you something valuable about frontier survival wisdom that actually worked when lives depended on it, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you one more proven technique from the people who survived without modern technology. Not because they were tougher, but because they were smarter. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.